so different in terms of values, norms, and sensibilities. For many English travelers and writers of that era, mm, reaching Port Said at the entrance of the Suez Canal marks a threshold, a definite line between the familiar civilized West and the perceived uncivilized East. The passage tone is quite melancholic, laden with the sense of loss. The traveler is imagined as leaving behind a superior known world and stepping into a mysterious and supposedly inferior unknown. Yet, paradoxically, the same journey is invested with moral grandeur. Despite the lament over what is being forsaken, the passage to India is seen as not just necessary but noble. It becomes enlightened with the ideological justifications of the British Empire. It is through such journeys that the empire supposedly extends its reach, not just through military and economic power, but by spreading enlightenment and education to the colonized. Uh, the idea here is somehow or the other crystallized in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which covers the English to send their best to serve and civilize the colonized people. These people are described in deeply problematic terms, and they are termed as fluttered folk and wild, half devil and half child. And this picture represents them as irrational, immature, and in need of paternalistic control. This ideology is so much steeped in racial and cultural superiority. The colonized are denied individuality and humanity. They are not recognized as people with valid worldviews or independent capacities for self governance. Instead, they are framed either as dangerous or demonic entities. There is no room for understanding or respecting their civilizations or the values that they carry or the system that they follow or any of their histories. Women are entirely absent from this narrative because they are considered unworthy, perhaps, of such a noble task, and because the task itself is of conquering, ruling, civilizing, which is seen as too brutal. So perhaps it would appear inappropriate for women. So that is the reason why women as a theme is being excluded, which further reinforces the hyper masculine nature of the imperial discourse. Equally deceptive is the idea that empire building is purely altruistic. There is a term burden which has been used, which implies suffering, sacrifice, selflessness. And yet, as history has shown, the empire was not a project of loss, but of massive gain for those who wielded power. The political dominance and economic enrichment that Britain enjoyed through colonization are absent from these noble sounding justifications. So, the text which is present in the passage Unit 1 does not seek to vilify Kipling, who is acknowledged as a complex literary figure, rather, to draw attention of how such ideas are so influential during the high noon of British Empire that they are echoed, contrasted, or critiqued in later literature. So much present in E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. Then there is another Kipling's poem, the exiles line, this too serves a deeper metaphor for the imperial enterprise. The poem describes the generations of Englishmen who serve in India and return home only after their service is done. They're imagined as part of a continuous chain linked by duty to empire. Yet, terms like wheel of empire and chain gangs suggest something darker, associations with punishment, servitude, and imprisonment. The language talks about empire, which is not just noble but also binding and burdensome in a moral, literal sense, perhaps even unjust. So there is an undercurrent of misery tied to the very idea of exile. But for the British in India, the land is not home but a place of duty, often endured rather than embraced. And yet, ironically, the same journey that causes this sense of dislocation can also represent liberation. The question here arises, can this imagined liberation from the rigidity of British society be understood in more acceptable terms? Can a journey to India be more than just a colonial mission or a site of personal escape? So, Foster's A Passage to India grapples with precisely this dilemma. He explores whether meaningful relationships, personal, cultural, or political, can exist between colonizers and the colonized. The novel navigates the ambiguities of such encounters, showing how the imperial context corrupts even well meaning intentions. Coming to the next passage, the title of the text, the passage that discusses about the novel derives its title and philosophical underpinnings from Walt Whitman's poem Passage to India, which is a part of Whitman's larger poetic work, Leaves of Grass. There is an assertion here that the novel indeed draws meaning and influence from Whitman's poem. Whitman's poem envisions a journey to India as a part of a larger divine plan. It imagines a world where the earth is interconnected by networks, where the seas and the oceans and the lands are all united, where there is diversity and inclusion, where there is harmony between different races and neighbors. The journey is absolutely symbolic and visionary as Whiteman appeals to a mystical and universalist idea that all divisions among humanity, whether cultural, geographical, spiritual, will eventually be healed. However, the text does not accept this poem without critical reflection. It points out that while the poem is rich in spiritual and utopian imagery, it also raises several different issues, especially when considered in relation to colonialization and the specific history of India. For example, the poem speaks of India only as a concept or symbol without referring to any specific cultural or social reality of Indian subcontinent. India becomes merely a metaphor or endpoint for a spiritual journey. The analysis also questions the theological and mystical optimism expressed in the poem. Whiteman talks about union among peoples and life forms, but the passage asks whether this dream of unity truly acknowledges the historical realities faced by colonized nations like India. The term comrade perfect, the identity of it, The passage challenges this. The ideal figure who supposedly embodies this spiritual unity and waits out of time and space. The passage questions this. It questions what this spiritual triumphalism has to do with the real India and what it means for India to be the symbolic endpoint of the poem's journey. So, there are other questions that this section addresses, and all of them had been clearly appraised in Forster's novel, which takes its title from the first line of Whiteman's poem. And in doing so, Forster engages with the poem's idealism but also questions it by showing the real world difficulties of cultural understanding and spiritual unity in colonial India. Next section talks about Forster's adaptation, where E.M. Forster's decision to title his novel A Passage to India, a slight variation on Walt Whitman line, Passage to India is far from trivial. On the surface, the only change is the addition of the indefinite article, but the commentary explains how this small grammatical shift of adding the article A before Passage to India significantly transforms the philosophical and thematic implications of the phrase. Where Whitman's phrase implies a singular, definitive journey to India as part of a grand, divinely ordained plan, which is romantic, idealistic, and universal. Foster's A Passage to India introduces tentativeness and ambiguity. By using the article A, Foster signals that the journey in question is just one of the many possible ones. In particular, that reflects uncertainty and subjectivity rather than universal certainty. The shift in tone and approach has further consequences. It decenters the authority of the author. Forster does not claim through the title that he has found the definitive passage to understanding India, whether geographically, politically, spiritually, or culturally. Now, this opens space for multiple interpretations. And here, the audience are not expected to follow passively along a predetermined route. Instead, they are invited to become cartographers themselves, active participants in mapping out meanings, experiences, and truths within the novel. The passage also situates both writers, as we discussed in the previous section, Whiteman and Foster, in the historical context of conflict and societal transformation. Whiteman was writing in the wake of the American Civil War, a time when the United States was attempting to forge a new national identity that bridged the industrial North and the agrarian South. His optimistic belief in American democracy and unity found expression in his epic Leaves of Grass, within which Passage to India appears. The author of the analysis acknowledges that Foster may not have fully addressed all the issues Whiteman overlooked, particularly around race, class, gender, but also suggests that there are echoes and contrast between the two writers that are worth exploring. So, this is all about Unit 1. Next, we come to Unit 2, representation of India approaches in the novel. In this unit, we study a conceptual and a thematic framework for reading the novel, one that is deeply rooted in Foster's overarching literary philosophy, most notably captured in the epigraph to his earlier novel, Howard's End. There is a line which reads, "Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted." This line does not this line does more than serve as a poetic gesture. It establishes a vital clue to understanding Foster's method in A Passage to India. Foster's desire to connect up and use all the fragments is presented not just as a personal philosophy but as a literary ethic. His writing thus becomes a space where different fragments, including the cultural, historical, emotional, and intellectual, are all brought into conservation. The question then arises, is this act of connection primarily an imaginative and empathetic project? Or does it lean toward a form of self expression that may ignore or override the political and cultural realities it represents? The tension here is central to interpreting the novel. On one hand, Foster seems to be promoting a humanistic, almost utopian idea of universal connection, but on the other, the colonial context within which he writes is so politically charged that any attempt at neutrality or pure empathy can appear naive or evasive. Regardless of how one answers this question, what emerges clearly is that A Passage to India is not a single unified type of novel. Rather, it is composed of several different kinds of writing, each representing a different mode of reality. Some of these are historical, that reflect real political and imperial conditions in colonial India. Some of them are literary, engaging with earlier genres such as travelogue or the 18th century house novel. Still, others are philosophical or spiritual, invoking larger questions about the nature of existence, divinity, and human relationships. The multiplicity of modes is especially evident from the very first chapter of the novel. As you would read this chapter, you would encounter a range of tones, from the realistic to symbolic, from the distant to the intimate, all of which establish different relationships between the narrator, the reader, and the represented India. These tonal shifts also highlight how layered and multifaceted Foster's India is. It is not a place that can be captured by any one perspective. It requires the interplay of multiple voices and interpretive lenses. The unit also promises to engage with various critical readings of the text. Each of these approaches, for example, historical, post colonial, structural, and otherwise, approaches uh, brings with it a certain emphasis and particular view of the country. For instance, a historical reading might focus on the factual and political context of British rule in India, seeing the novel as a document of imperial tensions. Now, if it is a post colonial critic, they might examine how power, identity, and race are negotiated in the colonial setting. If there is a philosophical reading, they might foreground the novel's metaphysical concerns, especially the role of Marabar caves and their echo. Each of these critically generates a different representation of India and allows a different set of issues to come into focus. What the writer expects is the readers should be encouraged, should remain motivated to keep the novel open while engaging with its analysis. The next section of Unit 2 talks about the travel guide that examines the first kind of writing found in A Passage to India. And there is a fascinating paradox with which it opens, that the novel begins by tricking the reader. At first glance, the tone and style of novel's opening passages appear to follow the conventions of a travel guide, offering descriptions of location, topography, and landmarks. But Foster is actually critiquing the format by mimicking the language of travel literature and then undermining its expectations. Foster exposes the limitations and inherent biasness of colonial representations of India. The initial description of Chandrapur, which is a fictional city, presents a city that is dull, ugly, and undistinguished, lacking in many natural beauty or architectural grandeur. There are words used like mean, ineffective, and filth, and all these words establish a tone of dreary disdain. The reader is led to believe that there is nothing special in the town except for the Marabar Caves, which lie 20 miles away. Through his setup, Foster appears to have made up the reader's mind before even there is a chance to imagine the town for the reader himself. In traditional travel guide fashion, the location are mapped in a kind of hierarchical structure with judgments passed on each ugliness spreading from one feature to another, as though every aspect of Chandrapur is interconnected in its lack of appeal. However, the key shift lies in the question of point of view. The language is aligned, the tone of colonial travel guide. The deeper purpose is not merely to describe, but to satirize. Furthermore, by beginning the novel with this parody and by immediately introducing the Marabar caves as the only noteworthy feature, Foster subverts the reader's expectations. The caves are not introduced with enthusiasm or reverence, but as a kind of mysterious tourist cliches or colonial generalizations. The caves themselves, as the story unfolds, become a space of symbolic confusion, of existential and cultural mystery, and ultimately of rupture. So, the travel guide style in the novel is not there to help the reader understand India in a factual sense, rather, it exists to demonstrate how limited or misleading and even harmful such understanding can be when filtered through colonial ideologies. Foster constructs this model of writing only to destabilize it. Then the next section is the history textbook that focuses the shift to how the novel incorporates yet another style of writing, the language and structure of a history book, and what implications this has for the novel's representation of India. If the travel guide organizes space, the history textbook organizes time. Through this framework, Foster critiques not only the way India is presented in historical narratives, but also how narratives often mask the recurring patterns of imperialism and oppression across eras. The reference to Chandrapur's past. Chandrapur was never large or beautiful, but 200 years ago it lay on the road between Upper India, then Imperial, and the sea. These are the words mentioned in the novel. So the reference to these words that talk about Chandraport's past immediately sets a tone of historic detachment. It evokes a past period when the town was perhaps more relevant, but only because it was part of a broader imperial route. Importantly, Foster introducing the phrase then imperial is loaded with subversive meaning. By calling Upper India then imperial, Foster's reminds us that British imperialism is not unique. India has seen multiple empires come and go, like the Mauryan Empire, which Foster had written about in a prior essay. Foster notes that the fine houses date from that period, 200 years ago, and adds that the zest for decoration stopped in the 18th century, nor was it ever democratic. This observation does several things at once. First, it ties the presence of grandeur and artistic effort to periods of elite power when the ruling class had both wealth and the desire to show it. But importantly, Foster adds that this decoration was never democratic. In other words, it was not for the people, it was a display of privilege by the few over the many, whether under ancient or modern imperial systems. This presents a view of Indian history and, by extension, world history, a recurring cycle of oppression where the ruled are consistently marginalized and beauty or architectural splendor becomes a symbol of that marginalization rather than of shared cultural achievement. There is a provocative and unresolved question. Is Forster using this history book style to critique imperialism, or does he unintentionally reinforce it by implying that India's history has always been shaped by conquest and domination? If oppression has been constant throughout history, whether under the Mauryas, the Mughals, or the British, then what difference does it make who rules? This is a morally complex position. It can be read as a cynical acceptance of history's cyclical violence or as a subtle but powerful argument against all forms of empire, which inevitably serve the interest of the few. There is a touch on class, though not as overtly as race or empire. The fine houses are associated with imperial privileges, but Foster does not deeply probe the class structure within India itself. While he does show that both the ancient and modern ruling classes benefited from their system of power, he stops short of fully exploring class inequality as a separate axis of critique. Then comes the another distinctive style of writing which is found in the novel, the romantic landscape, a romantic lyrical mode which is often used to describe the landscape. A romantic writing here refers to a kind of expression in which subjective emotion and imagination shape how the external world is depicted. It goes beyond realistic observations and turns into an interpretation of nature that reflects deeper human concerns or cosmic forces. One example provided in the passage, which is the poetic and the vivid description of the sky. The sky settles everything, not only climates and seasons, but when the earth shall be beautiful, by herself she can do little, only feeble outbursts of flowers. But when the sky chooses, glory can rain into the Chandrapur bazaars, or a benediction pass from horizon to horizon. At first glance, this kind of passage appears to be a lyrical appreciation of a specific scene in nature, But the explanation argues that this is more than just beautiful description. It is a part of a larger organizing principle in Foster writing. Foster uses romantic language to attempt to present nature as a force that transcends human divisions, especially the sharp separation between the Indian and British parts of Chandrapur. Nature becomes a symbol of a higher, more unified reality by showing the sky raining its beauty down on Chandrapur. Foster implies that the cosmos can bestow a form of grace or redemption that human systems, colonial or otherwise, cannot. The analysis goes further by calling this writing as psychoscape, a landscape shaped by psychological and imaginative forces. In romantic literature, the external world often reflects internal emotions, and here Foster uses landscape to mirror deeper philosophical and ethical ideas. The passage becomes not only a map of the land, but also a map of the mind. Nature does not recognize the boundaries that keep humanity apart, but by relying on romanticism, Foster opens up a space for imagining beauty and unity beyond the reach of imperialism and colonial control. Coming to the next section, the modernist quest considers another major literary framework through which Foster builds his narration: modernism. Modernism, as discussed in earlier contexts, is often associated with the breakdown of certainty, the questioning of grand narratives, and a deep sense of disorientation or fragmentation in the search for meaning. The very first sentence of the novel refers to them, and by the end of chapter 1, you'll come to know the narrative circles back to the caves again, emphasizing their central haunting presence. The caves do not simply represent a geographical feature, they symbolize something deeper and more abstract: the disturbance of reason, the failure of language, and the existential void that challenges any attempt to create a stable, rational order. So, this is all about Unit 2. We'll quickly go to Unit 3. Unit 3 talks about history and a passage to India. So, there would be a comparison between facts and fiction, and the years that are taken. The years that are taken in the backdrop of the passage is 1912 and 1913. It is taken from a historical commentary within a literary critical framework that mm, E.M. Foster applies in the novel. In fact, the passage that talks about 1912 and 13 begins by acknowledging that despite the impression of political quietude, individual protest against colonial rule could not be entirely suppressed. Foster himself had direct exposure to this undercurrent of unrest. An anecdote is cited involving a young Indian lawyer expressing defiance and confidence in eventual independence, even if it looked centuries. This demonstrates that Indian resistance, though not always violent or large scale, was deeply embedded in the popular consciousness and quietly simmered during the period. Now, in fiction, The passage discusses how E.M. Foster's engages with the political climate of the time, particularly the period of relative calm around 1912 and 13, and how that calm is used within the novel to explore deeper tensions. The argument begins by noting that although much of the novel is influenced by Foster's second visit to India in 1921, traces of his earlier visit in 1912 still resonate in the text. This earlier period is remembered almost nostalgically as a kind of lost golden age when politics had not yet poisoned interpersonal relationships. The excerpt from the novel about reflections suggesting that politics, while necessary for any meaningful change, are also damaging, and that they had not always been a divisive as they are now. Cambridge is evoked as a symbol of a balanced life where games, work, and social interactions coexisted harmoniously, something under colonial rule seems to lack due to wire pulling and fear. There is a question raised: is the idea of a non political life presented as something possible only in a place like England, and therefore as a kind of luxury that India cannot afford under colonial conditions? The suggestion is that India has moved beyond such an ideal. Being apolitical is no longer viable for Indians, and perhaps not even for the British anymore. What emerges from the reading of this passage is the recognition that Foster deliberately uses two time scales in the novel. One represented by the outdated but still influential figures like Sir Gilbert, and other that reflects the newer political sensibilities emerging in post World War I India. By blending the two, Foster highlights the stagnant nature of colonial rule, where change in rhetoric or personal does not equal true political transformation. The persistence of the colonial mindset, even in its more liberal form, underlines one of the novel's central themes, that real change under the British Raj is virtually impossible. Taking you to 1912 to 1922, in fact, there is a stark political and emotional contrast between the period of Foster's first visit to India in 1912-13 to his second visit in 1921-22. While the earlier period was marked by political dullness and a kind of superficial calm under colonial rule, the latter was a time of intense political excitement and upheaval. After World War One, Indians had supported the British war effort in hopes that their loyalty and sacrifices would be rewarded in a concrete step towards self government. However, rather than moving toward meaningful autonomy, the British government introduced the Montague Chelmsford reforms, which culminated in the Government of India Act of 1919. In fiction, the novel answers this through its depiction of fictional protest. The text explains that Foster uses the trial of Dr. Aziz as a focal point to explore the themes of individual and group protest against colonial injustice. There's a key moment in when the marginalized groups, specifically the sweepers and Muslim women, come together in response to the unfair imprisonment of Aziz. The sweeper strike mentioned in the extract from the novels show how political action is no longer limited to educated elites or middle class activists. but includes those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In letters and essays, this section delves deeper into the passage of India's treatment of nationalism, communalism, and their intersection with Foster's personal experiences and broader historical events. There's a reflection on how Foster shows that even Muslim characters like Aziz, while longing for unity, carry deep rooted communal assumptions. Aziz assures himself that India had always been Muslim, reveals a subconscious comfort derived from religious homogeneity. But even as Aziz imagines a future united under Islam alongside the Islamic nations like Afghanistan and Iran, the narrative subtly implies that this vision is flawed or insufficient. Foster does not present this transformation as simple or seamless. He is acutely aware of the deeply ingrained communal stereotypes that people carry. The novel reflects this in subtle interpersonal moments. For instance, when Aziz meets a Hindu acquaintance, he wishes Hindus did not smell of cow dung, exposing his own communal prejudices. Meanwhile, other often stereotype Muslims as inherently violent. These moments do not offer easy resolutions or clear messages. Instead, they illustrate how complex and fraught the relationships between communities can be, especially under colonial rule. 1945 and after, outside the novel, the passage acknowledges how the Second World War changed the global forum structure, weakening Britain's hold on its colonies and marking. Sir, just give me a second. I guess. Sorry for that. One key moment in Foster's personal connection with India was his third and final visit in 1945. He traveled to Jaipur to attend a conference organized by All India Poets, Essayists, and Novelists Club. His attendance and the very existence of such a literary gathering were symbolic of the changes occurring on Indian society. It signified an India that had evolved politically and culturally from the one he had experienced during his earlier visits. Still, Foster did not see transformation as a entirely linear or disconnected from the past. He was sensitive to the coexistence of progress and tradition, of modernity and history. At the conference, he described being watched by women observing from behind the Purda screen, symbolic of how the past continues to absorb and shape the present. Yet, Foster's views on these changes were often ambiguous or puzzling. There's a dialogue between Aziz and Fielding towards novel's end is particularly important. Fielding's mocking comment about India trying to join the sisterhood of nations and being compared to minor countries like Guatemala or Belgium serves multiple functions. On one level, it ridicules the Western construct of nationhood, especially the 19th century model of sovereign states competing for legitimacy and prestige. India, having once been the center of an ancient and vast civilization, is here portrayed as entering modernity belatedly and awkwardly. The notion of internationalism carries with it both promise and risk. On one hand, Foster offers a compelling idea that India's destiny may not be to become just another member of the international community of modern nation states, but to offer a new kind of philosophical or spiritual paradigm to the country. This idea, dangerously close to essentialism, the romantic and sometimes patronizing belief that India is inherently spiritual or mystical, has been often criticized for reducing a complex and dynamic society into a single static image. This idea makes the novel center of gravity from the political to the metaphysical, while the historical elements, imperialism, cultural conflict, racism, give the novel its concrete context and narrative tension. There are also the same elements which are not its final destination. Foster's ultimate concern is with how human beings try or often fail to find meaning in a world that resists easy understanding. India, with its vast landscape, complex religions, and deep historical resonances, becomes a backdrop against which this universal quest is staged. Thus, the consequence of Foster's shift from history to philosophy is not a denial of historical but a recognition that history alone cannot contain or explain the human condition. Unit 3, the novel, in Unit 3 in the novel uses the colonial situation not simply to comment on politics, but to pose deeper questions about identity or belongingness or the nature of reality. So, in doing so, a passage to India becomes more than record of a fading empire. It becomes a meditation on what it seems to be living meaningfully in a world that often resists understanding. So we take a break of 10 minutes. We see at 6 7. We meet at 6 7. So please take a break. Welcome back, all. So, let's quickly start with Unit 4. Unit 4 explores race, class, gender in Passage to India. So, it's a very critical framework when the novel introduces to the race, class, or gender, and especially when it is focusing or analyzing the novel through a historist lens. This means explaining the novel not as a neutral account of events or characters, but as a product shaped by the social, political, and economic forces of its time, especially through race, class, and gender. The narrative choice is significant because it immediately subverts the traditional colonial literary model where the imperial subject, usually British, is the point of entry into the story. Instead, E.M. Foster centers a passage to India on Dr. Aziz, a young Indian Muslim physician, offering readers a native's perspective from the outset. Aziz is not only the first character the readers meet, but he also embodies a kind of optimistic detachment, one that seeks joy in the moment and comfort in his environment. There is a line delicious indeed to lie on the broad veranda with the moon rising in front and the servants preparing dinner behind, and no trouble happening. This line establishes a tone of serenity and hints at a desire to remain disengaged from politics and social tensions. It is not because he is unaware of these tensions, but because he instinctively desires to preserve his personal dignity and peace, even as the world around him grows increasingly hostile and divided. Race, as a section, delves deeper into the emotional and psychological consequences of colonialism on Ajiz, the protagonist. The author here begins by illustrating Ajiz's discomfort in discussing the English, not because he harbors outright hatred, but because they bring discord into situations where he would rather feel joyful and untroubled. This reaction reflects his deep desire for harmony and emotional connection, which the presence of colonizers disrupt. Ajiz is portrayed as a character governed by emotion rather than politics. His strongest responses come not from the rational calculations but from personal and instinctive feelings. This is evident in his meeting with Mrs. Moore at the mosque, which holds profound emotional significance for him, not because of her identity as a British woman, but because of the genuine bond of sympathy he senses between them. Ajay's emotional world is further shaped by his desire for mutual affection. What he values most is not political freedom or social equality in the novel, but rather human intimacy, mutual respect, and sincere friendship. He is deeply affected by the fact that he has been rejected by his British colleagues, particularly the women, and this causes him pain because he values genuine interpersonal
Recording
connections.
in progress. आइए आकांक्षा बड़ोनिया रिसर्चर एट इम्प्री इम्पैक्ट एंड पॉलिसी रिसर्च प्रभाव एवं नीति अनुसंधान
Just give me a
संस्थान
second.
दिल्ली extend my warmest welcome to you all green.
Aji's ideal of friendship is rooted in shared feeling rather than shared nationality. For instance, Foster's describe how Aji's heart is stirred when he notices the affection and sympathy between Mrs. Moore and Adela, which allows him to believe that cross racial friendships might still be possible. When Aziz plans the picnic to Marabar Caves, he insists it is simply a social outing, not a political act, and he resents any suggestion that the racial background of its members matters. However, despite Ajiz's desire to escape the political realities of colonial India, the text insists that he is inevitably enmeshed within them. Whether he acknowledges it or not, he is a subject of empire, and that status defines his social reality. Foster makes it clear that Aziz, like every other Indian, is trapped within the structures of colonial control. This is poignantly illustrated when Aziz centers the civil lines, the area of British administrative power. The rigid, angular layout of the roads, named after imperial generals, become symbolic of Britain's suffocating grip over India. There is an emotional oppression felt by Aziz, but also his inner conflict is caught between a longing of personal freedom and the impossibility of escaping his social circumstances. When he visits Major Calendar's compound, he must restrain himself from expressing his rage. His sensitivity, the same emotional quality that makes him capable of deep friendship, becomes a source of pain under colonialism. The critic finds some of the Foster's portrayals of Aziz's decline under colonialism problematic. For example, Aziz is introduced as a skilled and intelligent doctor, yet by the end of the novel, he appears to regress. He abandons British influenced medicine, moves to the princely state of Mao, and expresses an anti Western attitude that seems extreme. The narrator questions whether this shift is fair or believable. The scene where Aziz suggests that a British doctor, Major Calendar, should have treated Mrs. Graceford instead of himself implies that British doctors are more competent, a judgment Aziz himself seems to internalize. Additionally, after Aziz treats a patient for typhoid, he forgets to boil water, an oversight that damages his professional credibility. The reader is meant to understand that colonial pressure has worn Aziz down to the point where he becomes careless and cynical. He no longer believes in the value of medicine, likening it to witchcraft. So the critic questions whether this transformation is realistic or whether Foster is using Aziz as a symbolic tool to illustrate the corrosive effect of empire. Even if Foster's broader argument that colonialism degrades the colonialized is valid, the application of that argument to Aziz may feel too drastic or pessimistic. On the central points being made is that Aziz, despite his emotional and poetic sensibilities, is not immune to the cultural stereotypes and inherited convictions that pervade colonial and post colonial societies. For Aziz and his peers, quoting these poets is not merely a matter of aesthetic or spiritual connection, it is a reinforcement of their belief that India has always, in some essential sense, been a Muslim land. This belief fosters a sense of entitlement and imagined imperial authority when Aziz thinks to himself that he seemed to know the land as much as anyone know it and dismisses the presence of Hindus and British alike. He demonstrates an internalized sense of cultural superiority. Foster, however, complicates the portrayal by showing that Ajiz eventually shifts from an imperial romanticized self image to a more socially conscious perspective. At the end of the novel, Ajiz begins to write poetry, not about past glories or cultural pride, but about pressing modern issues such as nationalism and the position of women in society. It is true that Foster is not always entirely sensitive in his portrayal. His comment that suspicion is the besetting limitation of an Indian is a clumsy generalization that risks reducing a character's personal flaws to racial traits. His dramatization of suspicion in the Ajiz Fielding relationship, especially in the latter part of the novel, can feel heavy handed. Foster himself reflects on this with a degree of honesty, admitting that something racial inevitably intruded into the arguments between Aziz and Fielding. Even when such intrusions are not bitter or malicious, they are unavoidable, embedded in skin color, in history, in power. When he describes their differences as coffee color versus pinko gray, he's not mocking either, but acknowledging that racial difference operates on a visceral level in colonial contexts. In such a setting, Foster suggests characters like Ajiz cannot attain the kind of dignity or moral authority that might be possible in a post colonial or anti colonial narrative. It makes a powerful statement in a world governed by empire. Even the inner life of its subjects is shaped, wrapped, and sometimes diminished by the structures of domination they cannot escape. There is a section named Godbole. Professor Godbole first steps into the novel wearing what seems to be a walking joke of an outfit, a character who uses a lilac turban that looked like pale purple macaroni, a western waistcoat and a coat over dhoti, and lavender clogged socks poking out over his shoes. On a surface level, Foster invites us to laugh. Godboli's appearance is a patchwork of East and West that looks ridiculous to English eyes. Yet the narrator, almost in the same breath, calls the insensible harmonious as if Godbole has, at least in intention, already effected a reconciliation that the novel's other characters will spend 400 pages failing to achieve. That double note of comic bathos and cosmic longings runs through very scene in most of the scenes in whichever he appears. From racial point of view, the professor is other twice over Indian to the English, Hindu to the Muslim Aziz. The English characters never confront that doubleness becomes something they cannot fathom. To them, he is simply a native. Aziz, by contrast, sees the racial divide every day, yet he too fails to breach the cultural one. Godbole's Hindu reticence frustrates Aji's quick Muslim sociability. This inability to cross lines of difference is exactly what Edward said calls the constitutive gesture of Orientalism. The West reduces the East to a set of fixed types, and in doing so, keeps it available for governance and dismissal. Foster does not leave Godbole imprisoned in stereotype. He grants him, especially in the temple section, a spiritual gravitas no other character attains. At Mao, on the festival night of Janmashtami, Godbole sings an old bhajan about Krishna's refusal to come to the milkmaid who pleads for him. Whether God appears, he insists, does not lie in human control, but the plea must be uttered nonetheless. Foster dramatizes Godbole's bhakti in the long paragraph that follows a song. The professor tries to hold a beatific vision. First, Mrs. Moreface, then an anonymous village woman, then a wasp, even a stone. Each image is swept into the orbit of devotion, the tiny replaced by the vaster, until conscious effort intrudes the moment he tries to include the stone, the vision collapses, and he finds himself circling on the red prayer mat while drum beats hammer outside. But what might have been a burlesque is also a confession of human limitation. No one, not even the holy man, can sustain oneness. The mind falters, the body reasserts, the social festival streams back in. Then we come to the character of Fielding. Fielding is portrayed as an unusual and suspect figure among his fellow English colonials because of his association with Indians and because he educates them. In the context of colonial rule, where the British maintained racial segregation and superiority, Fielding's close and social professional contact with the Indians is perceived as a betrayal of racial and colonial solidarity. His willingness to cross racial and cultural boundaries make him appear unsound or trustworthy in the eyes of his peers. Fielding's profession, that is teaching, is revolutionary in our colonial context because true education encourages free thought and the exchange of ideas, which threatens the authoritarian foundation of imperial control. In other words, by simply educating Indians, Fielding is engaged in a radical act that undermines the ideological justification of empire. Fielding's social actions, both at the Bridge Party and at his private tea party, are seen as evidence of his personal commitment to racial equality and mutual respect. Unlike figures such as Mr. Turton, who embody colonial superiority and keep their distance from Indians, Fielding actually mingles and converses with Indian guests on equal terms. At the bridge party, Fielding stays with the Indians and interacts with them naturally. The Indians, in turn, forgive his minor social mistakes, a mark of mutual goodwill and comfort rarely seen between colonizers and colonized in the novel. Fielding invites Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore to tea with Aziz and Godbole, not randomly, but because he knows these particular English women are not prejudiced against Indians. This reflects Fielding's thoughtfulness and his understanding that cross cultural encounters must be handled with care and mutual respect, a contrast to the more careless or hostile attitudes of other Anglo Indians. The section ends with a glimpse of Fielding's worldview, which is described as cosmopolitan and universalist. The world is a globe of men. This is an unfinished quote, likely alludes to Fielding's belief that humanity is united despite cultural and racial differences. He sees people not as members of exclusive groups, but as individuals with common dignity. In this, he stands out as a liberal humanist in a deeply divided colonial society. Fielding is depicted as a character who operates by the values of liberal humanism, a philosophy championed by E.M. Forster himself. This philosophy believes in the inherent value of individuals, in the power of personal relationships, and in culture, intelligence, and goodwill as tools to bridge the gaps between people. Fielding sees the world as populated not by races or nations, but by like minded individuals capable of forming meaningful connections across boundaries. The worldview is echoed in Foster's 1941 essay, What I Believe, in which he speaks of an aristocracy of the sensitive, the considerate, and the plucky, a class of people who, regardless of nation, class, or era, share a secret understanding and a commitment to kindness and humanity. So, Fielding represents this philosophy. He befriends Aziz purely on the basis of personal liking, ignoring the colonial racial divide. He defends Aziz as great social cost, alienating himself from the British community. He befriends Adela not because she is British, but because she is vulnerable after her collapse. He tries to understand Hinduism, even if he cannot fully grasp its religious core, but by acknowledging the impulse of love in Stella and Rolf. The passage also goes on to show that Foster does not present Fielding's ideals uncritically. He questions the effectiveness and realism of liberal humanism when placed in the colonial context. Fielding often behaves as though colonialism does not exist, as if he and Aziz can simply be friends outside the system of racial oppression that governs every interaction. But that's unrealistic. The colonial structure denies dignity and justice to Indians, and Fielding's failure to acknowledge this makes his ideals naive and detached. When Fielding is disappointed by Ajay's lack of dignity during the trial panic and its aftermath, he fails to recognize that dignity itself is systematically denied to Indians under British rule. Though liberal humanism values love and human connections, it is it offers no real alternative program for social or political change. When Aziz turns nationalistic at the end of novel, Fielding is unsympathetic and almost blind to the importance of India's desire for self-determination. So at the start of the novel, Ajay says that Indians respond best to personal kindness, and Fielding believes that being kind and decent will be enough. But by the end, Ajay comes to see Fielding's approach as insufficient and even as a kind of moral evasion. He urges Fielding and the British to leave India, suggesting that kindness alone, like a post dated check on a failing bank, is useless if it cannot address structural injustice. There is a section of class that operates as a theme in the passage of India, especially in relationship to those from the unorganized or lowest classes of Indian society. The analysis represents the marginalized individuals and whether their portrayal reflects radical inclusion or merely aesthetic objectification. It questions whether Foster gives them characters or simply uses them as a symbolic figure to reflect the perspectives of others, particularly the middle class character like Adela and Fielding. At the heart of this analysis is the idea that Forster attempts to broaden his narrative vision beyond the comfortable middle class world he had previously portrayed in novels like Howard's End. In this novel, he attempts to include the vast majority of Indians who are not part of elite or political discourse, those who are poor, uneducated, voiceless, and socially invisible. He acknowledges this explicitly in the novel, admitting that there are people so far removed from the cultural and political conversation that no earthly invitation can embrace them. They are beyond the reach of social structure or literal concern. However, the attempt to include them is ambiguous and troubling. Here, the text explores the complexity using the example of Pankhawala, a working class Indian man who silently fans the courtroom during Ajay's trial. On one hand, Foster appears to elevate this character by describing the physical beauty, aloofness, and symbolic detachment from the events unfolding around him. The Pankhawala becomes a metaphor for fate, indifferent, impassive, untouched by the colonial tensions that dominate the narrative. is described as divine, splendidly formed, possessing a rare beauty that nature sometimes bestows on those condemned as untouchable. Foster gives the Pankhawala no voice, no personality, and no interior life. He's seen someone as being admired and interpreted, particularly by Adela, but never heard. He remains an object, not a subject. It turns him into a kind of aesthetic or politically token, a way for Fosters to critique the British ruling class arrogance and delusion without actually allowing this marginalized figure to speak for himself. Coming to gender, the novel portrays women like Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested and how gender intersects with race and class to determine social status and voice. Although these women are part of the colonial elite, British, educated, and socially privileged, their gender marginalizes them in significant ways. Foster uses the character to explore how women can be both inside and outside systems of power at the same time. Mrs. Moore, for instance, is a powerful presence in the novel, not because of what she says or does in official terms, but because of what she intuitively feels. She believes that love, not force, should govern relationships between individuals and between nations. This belief is love as a universal human value rooted in her Christian sensibility stands in sharp contrast to the official British imperial attitude, which is based on control and hierarchy. Ronnie, her son, and a colonial magistrate, dismisses her views as the ramblings of weak, old woman prone to foolish spirituality, showing how female insight is often discredited by men in positions of authority. Even though Mrs. Moore understands and connects with Aziz in a deep and immediate way, calling forth Ajiz's description of her as Oriental in her instinctive empathy, she is still silenced in the narrative. She dies before the trial begins and cannot testify or act on Ajiz's behalf. However, her spiritual presence lingers. She becomes a symbol for the Indians, referred to affectionately and almost sacredly as Esmis Esmore. Yet, even in this revered form, she cannot speak. Her transformation into a ghost, a haunting figure remembered by both the British and Indians, reflects the invisibility and muteness imposed on women. Adela Quested presents a different kind of female marginality. She begins the novel with her desire to see the real India, a sentiment that seems earnest but is ultimately superficial. The collector organizes a party for her benefit, but it offers her only a surface level view. India as a decorative object, not a living culture. Ajis perceived this and is worried, sensing that Adela's interest in India may be just another expression of the imperial urge to dominate, masked as curiosity. Adela's defining moment comes with a incident that happened in the Marabar caves, which remains a mystery both to her and to the reader. What actually happens inside the cave is made never explicit, not because it is irrelevant, but because Adela is denied a voice. Her perspective is not fully explored, and she becomes another woman silenced not just by the colonial men around her, but by the structure of the novel itself. Moreover, Adela is described in unflattering terms, especially in regard to her physical appearance. The narrative emphasizes that she is not beautiful, and this lack of beauty seems to correlate with a lack of sympathy for her character. The section on Purda, the traditional seclusion of women in India, highlights how gender oppression crosses racial lines. Purda, originally a response to foreign invention, evolved into a broader system of control based on religion, tradition, and gender hierarchy. At the Bridge Party, when Indians and British characters interact awkwardly, The consequences of parda are visible. The Indian women are distant and invisible, showing how gender segregation maintains barriers between cultures and within society itself. So, in short, novel that women, whether British or Indian, are often spoken for, spoken about, are silenced entirely, whether through paternalistic dismissal, aesthetic rejection, or cultural seclusion. Female characters are constantly pushed into the margins of power and discourse. And while Foster is aware of this silencing, his own narrative structure often reproduces it, making A Passage to India not just a novel about race and empire, but also about the invisibility of women's voices within those systems. End of Unit 4. Quickly taking you all to Unit 5, representation of India, religion. So there are three religions that the novel is representing. One is Christianity, one is Hinduism, one is Islam. E. Foster's deep ambivalence towards the religion, both as a spiritual philosophy and as a tool of imperial power, shows that while Foster respected Christian ideals like love and moral universality, he was also skeptical about how Christianity was practiced, particularly by missionaries and colonists, and how inadequate it was in grappling with the spiritual and cultural complexity of India. Foster did not feel a personal affinity with the Christ, finding him humorless and lacking intellectual charisma. These qualities made Christ and by extension Christianity seem emotionally and intellectually uninviting. Foster viewed Christianity through the lens of empire, commerce, and class privilege. It had become, in his view, morally compromised, a tool for justifying imperialism under the guise of spiritual salvation. He regarded missionary work as a indulgence, a way for the British middle class to feel good about their economic advantages by spending them on moral projects that interfered with the religious and cultural lives of colonialized people. Mrs. Moore believed that God is love forms the novel's most sincere Christian perspective. Unlike the missionaries or officials, her version of Christianity rejects force as a foundation for empire, emphasizes personal connection and intuitive empathy, especially in her relationship with Aziz, and stands in moral contrast to the official British view of India as something to dominate. We come to the section where Islam is being discussed. Foster presents Islam in a manner that is simultaneously sympathetic, aestheticized, and subtly ambivalent. His depiction reflects both his personal appreciation of certain Islamic ideals and his philosophical stance that no single religion is fully adequate for grasping the totality of human experiences, especially within the vast and chaotic context of India. Foster's earlier essays reveal that his admiration for Islam was often shaped by a reaction against Christianity. He perceived Islam as a religion that lacked the ritualistic hierarchy and doctrinal rigidity of Christianity. He emphasized that unlike Christian churches, which are often loaded with architectural symbolism and historical relics meant to evoke sacred presence, Mosques are fundamentally open spaces, courtyards meant for communal prayer and individual spiritual focus. Absence of physical incarnation of God in Islam impressed Foster because it suggested a purity and simplicity of worship. The mosque therefore represents democratic spirituality. There are no priests to mediate between the believer and God, no spatial hierarchy to structure power within the space. This reflects an ideal of spiritual equality, which Foster found lacking in Christian practice, while Christianity proclaims equality before God. In practice, it often stratifies worship through ritual and institutional control. Islam, in contrast, as Foster observed, is built around the principle that all are equidistant from God, both physically in the mosque and spiritually in the doctrine. The unit also presents Hinduism as a nuanced and evolving portrayal of E.M. Foster's understanding of the religion, both as a religious and cultural force, particularly expressed in his broader writings as initially Foster's perception of Hinduism is marked by confusion and discomfort. He contrasts it unfavorably with Islam, which he sees as more structured, familiar, and emotionally coherent from a Western perspective. He finds Islam religious expression to have a clarity and simplicity, whereas Hinduism strikes him as chaotic, cluttered, and almost unreadable in its surface level manifestation. When he describes his experience of the Gokulashtami celebrations, he is overwhelmed by what he perceives as visual realistic excess. The overcrowded symbols, the seemingly garish decoration, all of these appears meaningless or tasteless to the outsider eye. However, this initial discomfort begins to shift when Foster starts to consider the religious experience from within, particularly by observing the genuine serenity and ecstasy on the face of the Hindu worshippers. This moment marks the beginning of Foster's attempt to grasp an interior vision of Hinduism, which culminates in the final section of a passage of in Passage to India. He starts to realize that what appears chaotic or incoherent to the outsider might be, in fact, more meaningful and deeply spiritual to the insider. The religions embrace all aspects of existence, beautiful and ugly, sacred and profane, seems to resonate with the philosophical wholenessness that other more exclusive and hierarchical religions like Christianity or even Islam might lack. Foster had a deeper understanding to appreciate Hinduism inclusivity, its mysticism, and its ability to provide individual worshippers a direct relationship with the divine without mediation by a priesthood or congregation. Foster's fusion of Hinduism with the idea of India itself, treating Hinduism as synonymous with Indian identity, carries problematic implications. It risks marginalizing the country's enormous religious and cultural diversity, reducing India to a monolithic entity defined by the mythical, mystical, and irrational aspect of in Hindu tradition. Coming to the last unit, passages to India. Foster's evolving understanding of Hinduism is traced through both his personal reflections and his fictional representation in the novel. Initially, Foster is deeply uncomfortable with Hinduism. He finds it chaotic, aesthetically unpleasant, and spiritually baffling, especially when compared to the clarity and order he perceives in Islam. This is evident in his early reactions from devas, where he felt relief in turning away from Hinduism to engage with the more familiar Islamic world. He describes Hindu rituals as disorganized, distasteful, cluttered with garish imagery, and lacking a coherent sense of beauty or purpose. However, he is simultaneously aware that this is a perception from an outsider's viewpoint and aesthetic and cultural misunderstanding rather than an objective truth. This tension between outward disorder and inward meaning becomes central to his later reflections. Through his experiences in Devas and the spiritual practices he witnesses there, Foster begins to appreciate that Hinduism's seeming chaos might mask a deeper, more inclusive logic. He observes that the religion encompasses the entire spectrum of life, divine and profane, joyous and tragic, human and animal, without seeking to categorize or exclude. He notes Hinduism is not based on congregational rituals or formal doctrine, but on the individual's relationship with the divine. This individual centered spirituality, which lacks the hierarchical control of a priesthood, impresses Foster with its openness. It offers a personal, flexible path to transcendence and allows the worshipper direct, private access to God, something that appeals deeply to Foster's own skepticism of institutional religion. One of the most powerful metaphors he uses to understand this complexity is that of the Hindu temple, its ornate and sometimes bewildering exterior, filled with carvings of every imaginable aspect of life, contrasting with the inner sanctum, a quiet, unadorned space meant for communion with the divine. This spatial metaphor illustrates how Hinduism accommodates the full messiness of life while still preserving a core spiritual stillness. Foster also voices his ambivalence. He frames the worship as a desperate act by human spirit trying to ravish the unknown, throwing away science, history, and even beauty in the process. He questions whether this spiritual act succeeds, suggesting a continued tension in his understanding, while he appreciates the depth of feeling and the sense of unity Hinduism creates, he remains uncertain about its relationship to rationality and modernity. His concern becomes particularly evident in the portrayal of Ajis, who, under influence of the Hindu state of Mao, abandons his scientific career and nationalistic ambitions in favor of emotional withdrawal and mystical detachment. Foster appears uneasy with this transformation, raising the question of whether spiritual transcendence must come at the cost of political and intellectual engagement. Moreover, Foster's conflation of Hinduism with Indian identity raises additional problems. By treating Hinduism as synonymous with India, he overlooks the subcontinent's religious diversity and pluralistic traditions. His portrayal, however sympathetic, risks reproducing the Orientalist idea of India as a mysterious, irrational land in contrast to the West's supposed rationality. While he moves away from the earlier colonial stereotypes by treating Hinduism seriously and with reverence, he still falls into the trap of seeing cultural complexity as confusion and spiritual depth as anti modern. Still, Foster portrayals show growth. He chooses not to rely on traditional Western aesthetic ideals to describe Hinduism. There are no marble churches or moonlit mosques. Instead, there is a crowded, colorful, noisy chaos of Indian festivals and temples. Foster treatment of Hinduism reflects both respect and hesitation. He sees in it a profound capacity for love and inclusiveness, qualities that could heal colonial divisions. Yet he remains uncertain whether it offers a viable framework for political or intellectual life in modern India. In doing so, he leaves readers with a paradox. Hinduism is portrayed as spiritually expansive, yet socially ambiguous, a faith that unites on a cosmic level but complicates the human, historical, and national dimensions of Indian identity. So we are done for the day. We are done with all the 6 units. We are done with block 8. So tomorrow would be the last block, and it's Muriel Spark, the prime of Miss John Brody. So that is what we are going to study tomorrow. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
madam.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all. Thank you.